Hello and welcome to the Ragnarok Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is the channel where we talk about the lore of the books that I am writing. Or should I say, have written at this point. That's not to say in turn that I am done writing. I mean, if you've watched anything on this channel, you may appreciate that I have a lot more still down the pipeline, but yes, these have been written thus far. If you didn't see last Saturday's live stream or any of the other pre-announcements the couple of weeks before that, the final book in this first set, so that being Tower of the Storm, capping off this 2016 series of the Ragnarok Chronicles, is out now on Amazon in paperback and ebooks form, as are all the other books. Also, like the other books, links are in the description below. If you want to find out more about this series, I have done other videos talking about them specifically, or maybe you just feel like supporting my book series without knowing anything about it, I don't know. Either way, just maybe at least consider looking into it if you are interested or have room for a sci-fi mythology adventure. With that, the actual main body of this video isn't something where there is a big decisive point that I'm working towards at the end, it's not an argument I'm making or a planned discussion. It is more that I wish to simply talk you through an understanding of some of the rationale that I have in mind when I go about plotting out my stories or creating them from the start. Specifically, as has been indicated by the thumbnail and the title, in regards to balancing it being grounded versus it being fantastical. Now that we have all of this set of four to see at once, hence why I'm doing this video now, that they're all out, we can see that, again, at least in these, I have tried to have it that they would exist within our actual world. Indeed, that is what the Ragnarok Chronicles is meant to be. It's meant to be our multiverse, just a different outlook on it. For this, we have acknowledgements of, if we are looking at other people around the world, they aren't going to be speaking English, they're going to be speaking their own respective languages, which is why, where relevant, I have had to, in the writing process, reach out to other people who do speak those other languages to check my translations, because I can't do it on my own. We're looking at how things may fit in within political climates of the time, even if I'm not specifically acknowledging any of those. And we're even at a point where, something I'm sure I've mentioned before, when writing book 2, there's an early sequence set in New Scotland Yard. At the time, I was adamant that no, I had to get an access to a floor plan of the real New Scotland Yard, because I had to describe everything as being in the right place. Because if they go out of this room, then what kind of corridor are they going to come out to? Because otherwise it would be inaccurate. We're trying to embed this as much as in reality as possible, and any discrepancies from reality are breaking that illusion of these being one and the same. Now, obviously, for the fact that this is science fiction and taking on different interpretations of myths, having your characters like Philip Quint the Mancynn, with all of his abilities, all the brother-in-laws as your alien immortals, those things are not grounded in reality. Those are very much being added into it. So there is a matter of finding a line where, whilst doing all of these fantastical story elements, how nevertheless can we keep this embedded and earthed to earth as much as we can? This then does just come down to trying to add in details about the situations that could arise from a real-world standpoint that they're going through, trying to also, just on a personal thing, even if these characters are fictitious, having them undertake realistic behaviours and actions, not just solely what the story necessitates, having them have realistic, human reactions to things as well, and this hopefully to an extent that we can slightly overlook certain technologies acting a bit more magically than they should, or operations within certain locations perhaps not actually being conducted in the way they really would be being done. The more important aspect, though, is rather when, other than telling those specific stories, I would want to think about doing something more actual fantasy. It is important to note here that I do hold myself to different standards just automatically to other things, whereby I am a big fan of fantasy itself. Love Lord of the Rings and other things where magic is being involved. However, I cannot easily do those kind of stories myself, because, as I say, in anyone else's work, I can immediately just accept, yes, there's magic in that world, there's magic and whatever. As soon as I try to do a story myself, it's, nope, that doesn't make sense. And ultimately, from a magical standpoint, I've done a video previously on magic and science fiction. I've explained how I will end up doing it in one sense in a future set of books from the Ragnarok Chronicles, but just ignoring all of the sciencey background explanation that's specific to the multiverse of these books that I came up with, if we're just thinking about traditional magic, I can't help when trying to use it myself but think, but how is this actually working? Even if, say, within your magical universe it's not Earth, it's some other realm, and it was rather created by gods, that i.e. a pantheon that wasn't the Big Bang and everything else. Nevertheless, this is a world that is made up of atoms and is obeying the laws of physics and so forth. Where is magic coming into this? What is it? What is this force? What is generating it? Because it has to be being generated from somewhere, even if not strictly on the world. What's happening with it? And I know that, look, in these fantasy realms, you can have people who do come up with these explanations in the universe, and okay, sure. So then, why would saying a couple of words in a specific human language have an effect? Why would it be different if you did this thing in a different way, different motions? Why should these different ingredients come together in a potion or a ritual? Why is this? And again, you can come up with these different rationales, maybe in terms of items and movements, and saying it's not specifically about those, rather it's about the belief that they would have a certain effect. But then why is belief having an impact on these things? You can come up with these explanations, yet nevertheless, compared to with science fiction, in which case, even if it is these bizarre things with aliens and UFOs and spaceships and warp drives and all this other stuff, nevertheless, there is some techno-babble behind it, which in turn you can kind of connect to science concepts. I can do that, but if rather it is something really detached, will probably also tie into the fact that I have no spiritual beliefs or beliefs in the paranormal or anything like that. It's just all coming down to the same thing of, if I set myself the task of coming up with that sort of story, there's, as I say, immediate wall of, I don't know how to justify this. It is too fantastical for me to start building a world around it without completely undermining it and giving it some other non-fantasy explanation instead. Hopefully that's a flaw that I can get over eventually, but right now that's where I stand. Granted, I did, though, manage to use that sort of thing in my Game of Thrones sequel videos, so maybe there is in turn an element of, if I'm not coming up with the universe, with the story, then it's fine if I'm more building on someone else's, but nevertheless, in my case with the books, I am talking about creating everything from scratch myself. And not just the Ragnarok Chronicles. Obviously, if I was doing a pure fantasy thing, then that would be a separate work that I'd be doing. As for then looking at this from another angle in turn, let's think about an episode of Doctor Who called Dinosaurs on a Spaceship, which, even if you haven't seen it, hopefully the title should convey everything that you need to know. We are taking something that was real and putting it into something else which, okay, not real in the sense that it's used in a show, but it's a real actual concept of a spaceship, and yeah, the dinosaurs are meant to be on, combining them together. This is a form of story generation, coming up with concepts which can help to keep ideas bizarre and feeling original and just mixing things up, as is literally happening with taking those two elements, taking a thing, taking a location that are meant to be together, put them together. I do not come up with those sorts of things because that is just not how my brain is going to think about it. My immediate reaction to that is that no, dinosaurs aren't on spaceships. That's just not a thing that happened, therefore it can't be done. Obviously, if you actually then think about, well, if you were to do it, how to do the story, especially if you're in a sci-fi setting, which you would have to be for that. But yeah, you can come around to ways of making it work, as they then did, but still, that is my initial reaction I'd be coming across if I am presented with that by somebody else. It's even harder for me to come up with that on my own, because again, it just doesn't cross my mind that I would be combining elements in that way. That's not to say that you can't, in terms of my story generation, have an odd thing in an odd place, but to give another example of another Doctor Who episode, Empress of Mars, we have here a group of Victorian soldiers. I think they're Victorian, maybe Edwardian. Either way, from British history, colonial soldiers, and they are on the surface of Mars. Now, again, once you actually watch the episode, they justify it, and the episode's fine, but from initially hearing that premise, my immediate reaction was, no, that's wrong. They weren't there. Real group of people, even if not actually individuals, but real type of person in a real location doesn't work. And again, I could be sure that it's the fact that they're both real things that's what the problem is, because one of the future stories that will happen within the Ragnarok Chronicles, to not give any spoilery specifics, involves groups of people suddenly finding themselves relocated to another planet. And again, these are real communities of people. The difference is, the planet isn't real. It's a completely fictitious place with completely fictitious other life forms, other circumstances, reasons as to why they are there. This is not saying that one is inherently better than the other, or even that potentially the stories would end up being vastly different if I, for instance, didn't know about Empress of Mars to begin with, or it hadn't been made. Simply that it didn't even cross my mind that in that story, those real people would end up on another actually acknowledged planet. Of course I was going to make up a brand new one. This is a case where, as a general principle, unless I am specifically thinking about, okay, I want to put an group of real things in a real place, there inherently has to be a fantastical element to it in order for it to have crossed my mind in the first place, to then be built out into a greater story. Alternatively, you have a real place with then fictitious creatures appearing there, which isn't actually that impressive, because that is more or less the premise of the majority of sorts of stories, with something unusual appearing in a known location. On the scientific front, if you've read any of the books yet, you may notice that I do try to use scientific explanations for certain things. Again, this is a part of grounding rather than just being pure magic, or I'm going to say that this happens and we're not going to worry about any justification for it. Try to use some sort of logic or science behind it. However, having researched something that kind of is related to it potentially in theory and sounds clever, I am then applying it and twisting it in a way that ultimately probably doesn't make as much sense there. So, where does that lie with things? That really might actually encapsulate this whole principle of where the line is being drawn between grounded versus fantastical. And taking real-world things and doing that research and trying to get in the details that will benefit and create enough groundwork as necessary, but then ultimately in building on top of that and taking it in other directions that don't really work, and that's then why it's science fiction rather than science fact. And it's that sort of thing that really is going to be left with once we get into later stories where we're beyond what would be contemporary Earth during the releases, and we're either out somewhere else or still on Earth, but with other futuristic standards to consider. Well, I mean, in terms of grounding, we can try to project what kind of a level of technology might we expect or predict to be at given the existing rate, rather than just saying, in 10 years we're suddenly going to have all of these different things. But, yeah, still, again, mostly thinking about space-based things. I have the conceits that I wish to execute upon in terms of the underlying stories, the plots, and it's then just a matter of, when I'm doing that, having to consider what possible things can the characters do in those situations, and how can we explain this sort of thing as working, or do we have to reconsider? Which, saying it like that probably just makes it feel that we are obviously going to need to do that. But again, you could otherwise just... With the Mancyns, I have the whole explanation of them being imbued with Ziangg / dark matter / prima materia, and the fact that that material in turn is tied into the baseline of reality, which specifically is done for the Alpha Realm and the Inner Region and all the other parts of this multiverse, and how that ultimately then comes back to allow them to manipulate reality around them. I've built in this explanation into the interpretation of existence in these books. It's not rather me just saying, oh, this person, Philip, is a Mancynn, he can do this, and saying nothing about it. And in that vein, that is a pursuit of explanation I'm going to have to try to get to again when we get to a future series of books where I have now, relatively more recently, added in other things which could be ascribed as deities, which, until I started adding other caveats in the notes that we should probably try to pin this stuff down, at that stage would just be left to saying they can do whatever they want. But how? There needs to be some sort of grounding to keep on using, keep on using that word. Otherwise, there are no parameters, there are no stakes. And, you can try to, as some will attempt to do in hard magic systems, I think that's what you call it, in fantasy and so forth, but even then, because I would be making up those rules, it's like how if you try to give yourself a deadline for something that you're doing. Again, it depends on how you do with getting tasks done, but potentially if you need to give yourself a deadline, because you're the one who made it up, you know that it's not a concrete thing, it's not externally enforced, so you can just have your mind be slightly more convincing about bypassing it, not worrying about it as much. In this case, if I was to come up with a hard magic system, I could then allow anything to happen. There wants to be at least something which can be tied back to in logic, in science, or whatever it is in real-world existing parallels, cultures, details, to keep things steady, keep things feeling like it's still attached to our world as it is meant to be. Hopefully that made some sort of sense and didn't come across as contradictory or hypocritical or whatever. As I said at the top, this is more meant to be just trying to convey a sense of what I am thinking or feeling when crafting these stories, rather than it being a distinct point that I am trying to make. The human mind can be contradictory in these sorts of cases, and that may well be, and I may, under whatever circumstances, find one thing I am comfortable doing A, whereas in another case I'm not, and rather will have to do B. It's all abstract, we'll just have to see through execution, but when I am doing these sort of things, and when I am finding myself thinking, oh, actually I'd like to do this kind of story as well, because I am compelled to try to do every single kind of story eventually, I then, for some of them, may be immediately faced with exactly this sort of train of thought about, well, actually, can I do that? Or am I immediately hitting a brick wall with, but that doesn't make sense? If it did, as I say, make sense, or come across in some coherent way, even if we were bouncing about a bit, let me know what you think. I don't know what you're going to say to that, but you can say things as ever if you want, and do all the other things that you do to the YouTube channel. The main thing is, whatever you choose to do, just keep on telling stories, hopefully in a easier way than how I apparently do it. Okay, so this doesn't fit into this video at all, but it's something that I've meant to mention a few times previously. First in the Alien Analysis, the Asnomoids of the Planthias, then in Alien Architecture, and lastly in Saturday's live stream. All opportunities to do it, and I kept forgetting every single time, despite planning to every single time, so I'm going to make sure that I'm saying it here. Relating to the Asnomoids as an alien species, with their culture and so forth specifically, something that you may come across in the stories is a hand gesture, which is a mark of respect or honourable acknowledgement of whatever's just been said. So what we'll have here is either hand, but I'll do it with my left because I'm left-handed. So because they also have 5 digits, they would tap their thumb and ring finger, then ring to first to little, little to middle, and then lastly middle to thumb. So in theory, that was actually one of the best times I've ever done it. So they would do it more adeptly than that. Just so, another detail that you can add in if you're building up your picture of them.